August 1944. The city of Warsaw is a landscape of fire and rubble. The Polish Home Army has risen, fighting with the desperation of a people who have lived through 5 years of hell. But as the smoke clears over the district of Wola, the Polish fighters see a unit approaching that looks different from any German formation they have ever encountered. These are not professional soldiers. They are not disciplined Wehrmacht infantry. They are men in mismatched uniforms, some wearing civilian coats over their tunics, their eyes wide with a frantic, predatory hunger. They carry flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets, and they move with a chaotic, violent energy that feels more like a riot than an assault. At their head is a man who looks more like a ghost than a general. He is gaunt, his face a map of deep lines and scars, his eyes sunken and cold. This is Oskar Dirlewanger. And the men following him are the Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit composed of convicted murderers, rapists, and psychopaths released from Germany's harshest prisons. In the next few days, they will commit crimes so depraved, so utterly devoid of human mercy, that even the most fanatical SS commanders will be sickened. They will murder 40,000 civilians in cold blood. They will burn hospitals with the patients still inside. They will treat the city of Warsaw as their personal hunting ground. This is the story of the man the Nazis called the Black Hunter. It is the story of the most hated unit in the history of warfare, and it is the story of the general who was so brutal, so monstrous, that he became a scandal even for the Third Reich. To understand the monster, you first have to understand the wreckage of his life. Oskar Dirlewanger was born in 1895 in Würzburg, Germany. He was a child of the Great War, serving as an officer in World War I, where he earned the Iron Cross first and second class. He was a brave soldier, but even then, his comrades noticed a streak of cruelty that went beyond the requirements of combat. When the war ended, Dirlewanger didn't go home to a quiet life. He joined the Freikorps, the right-wing paramilitary groups that fought in the streets of post-war Germany. He was a man who needed violence to feel alive. But by the 1930s, his violence had turned into a different kind of darkness. He was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault against minors. He was a disgraced alcoholic, a criminal who had lost his academic doctorate and his military rank. He was the dregs of society, a man who should have died in a prison cell. But in the Third Reich, a man who is willing to be a monster is always in demand. Dirlewanger had a powerful friend, Gottlob Berger, the head of the SS main office. Berger believed that Germany's criminals could be used as a weapon. He believed that men who had already crossed the line into depravity were the perfect tools for the special tasks required in the East. In 1940, Berger secured Dirlewanger's release and gave him a mission: form a unit of poachers, men who knew how to hunt and kill in the woods, to fight partisans in occupied Poland. It started small, the Wilddiebkommando Oranienburg. But as the war in the East grew more brutal, the unit expanded. Dirlewanger was no longer just recruiting poachers. He was recruiting from the concentration camps. He was walking into the barracks of murderers and telling them, "Follow me, and I will give you a license to do whatever you want." It was a deal with the devil. These men were given uniforms and weapons, but no training in military discipline. They were taught only one thing: total war. By 1942, the unit was moved to Belarus, and the legend of the Black Hunter began to grow. Belarus was a nightmare of forest warfare and partisan resistance. The German army was struggling to control the vast territories behind the lines. Dirlewanger's solution was simple: scorched earth. He didn't distinguish between partisans and civilians. To him, every village was a target, every living thing an enemy. He developed a ritual for his anti-partisan operations. His men would surround a village at dawn. They would herd the entire population, men, women, and children, into the largest wooden structure, usually a barn or a church. Then they would bolt the doors. They would pile straw around the walls and douse it in gasoline. Dirlewanger would personally give the order to light the fire. As the building turned into an oven, his men would set up machine guns. If anyone tried to crawl through the windows or break through the doors, they were cut down. The screams of the dying were the soundtrack to Dirlewanger's career. He didn't just burn villages. He celebrated it. He would sit nearby, drinking schnapps, watching the smoke rise. He believed he was purifying the land. In Belarus alone, his unit burned over 200 villages to the ground. The death toll was in the tens of thousands. But the horror was not just in the killing, it was in the way they killed. Dirlewanger's men were encouraged to be as cruel as possible. They used bayonets on infants to save ammunition. They committed mass sexual violence as a matter of policy. They were a pack of wolves in human skin, and Dirlewanger was their alpha. But even as the unit grew in size and reputation, the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, began to voice their disgust. Reports began to filter back to Berlin from officers who had witnessed Dirlewanger's work. They called him a degenerate and a sadist. They complained that his unit was a disgrace to the German uniform. One Wehrmacht colonel wrote that Dirlewanger's men were the scum of the earth, and that their presence made it impossible to win the hearts and minds of the local population. But Dirlewanger was protected. Gottlob Berger and Heinrich Himmler loved him. Himmler saw Dirlewanger as a primitive force, a man who understood the racial struggle in its purest form. While other generals worried about supply lines and strategic objectives, Dirlewanger focused on the biological destruction of the enemy. Himmler promoted him. He gave him the Knight's Cross. He expanded the unit into the SS Sturm Brigade Dirlewanger. By 1944, the unit had grown to 4,000 men. They were no longer just a small band of criminals. They were a brigade of the damned. Then came Warsaw. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1, 1944. It was the largest single act of resistance in occupied Europe. For the Nazis, it was an insult that had to be wiped out with extreme prejudice. Himmler ordered the city to be razed to the ground and every inhabitant killed. He knew exactly which unit to send to lead the slaughter. Dirlewanger arrived in Warsaw on August 4th. He was given a sector in the Wola district. What happened over the next 3 days is known to history as the Wola Massacre. It is one of the darkest chapters in human history. Dirlewanger's men didn't just fight the Polish Home Army. They ignored them. They went from house to house, starting with the hospitals. In the Wola district hospital, they found hundreds of wounded patients and nurses. They didn't ask questions. They used flamethrowers in the wards. They dragged the doctors into the street and executed them. Then they moved to the apartment blocks. They herded thousands of civilians into the local parks and cemeteries. They lined them up and began firing. They didn't stop for 3 days. The piles of bodies were so high that the German tanks couldn't move through the streets. Dirlewanger ordered his men to douse the piles of corpses in gasoline and set them on fire to clear the way. The city was covered in a thick, greasy black soot that smelled of burning hair and flesh. The death toll in Wola reached 40,000 people in 72 hours. But even in this landscape of mass murder, Dirlewanger found ways to be more depraved. He encouraged his men to engage in competitive cruelty. There are documented reports of his soldiers throwing babies out of windows and catching them on bayonets for sport. They used children as human shields, tying them to the fronts of their tanks as they advanced into Polish barricades. They were a unit of psychopaths given total authority over a civilian population, and they took every advantage of it. The brutality was so extreme that it triggered a crisis within the German High Command. General Heinz Guderian, the chief of the General Staff, was horrified. He went to Hitler personally and demanded that Dirlewanger be removed from Warsaw. He argued that the brigade's actions were so disgusting that they were undermining the morale of the regular German troops. Even the SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who was the overall commander in Warsaw and a man responsible for his own share of atrocities, was repulsed by Dirlewanger. He wrote in his diary that Dirlewanger was the most dangerous man in the SS and that his unit was a plague. He described Dirlewanger as a man who lived in a permanent state of alcoholic rage, a man who couldn't be controlled by any military authority. But again, the protection of the high-ranking Nazis held. Dirlewanger stayed. He was promoted to SS Oberführer. He was given more men. He continued the slaughter until the uprising was finally crushed in October. By then, Warsaw was a graveyard. 200,000 civilians were dead. The city was a desert of brick and ash. Dirlewanger left Warsaw as a hero of the SS, but as a pariah to the military establishment. As the war turned against Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, the Dirlewanger Brigade was sent to the front to stop the advancing Red Army. This was a different kind of war. The Soviet soldiers weren't civilians in Belarus or partisans in Warsaw. They were a massive, vengeful machine of professional warriors. Dirlewanger's unit, which was built for murdering the helpless, began to crumble when faced with real combat. His men, who were brave when they were burning barns, turned into cowards when they faced Soviet tanks. Desertion rates skyrocketed. Dirlewanger's response was more violence. He began executing his own men for the slightest sign of hesitation. He would walk through the trenches with a submachine gun, personally shooting any soldier who looked like they were going to run. But you can't stop an empire with a submachine gun. The brigade was moved to Slovakia to crush another uprising, then to Hungary, and finally back to the Oder front to defend the heart of Germany. By now, the unit was no longer just criminals. It had been expanded into the 36th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS. It was a division in name only. It was a collection of broken men, forced laborers, and the last remnants of the prison camps. Dirlewanger himself was wounded in February 1945. It was his 12th wound of the war. He was sent to a hospital in the rear, leaving his division to be obliterated by the Soviet steamroller. The Dirlewanger division was virtually wiped out in the Halbe Pocket in April 1945. Only a few hundred men survived to surrender to the Americans. They were the lucky ones. For Oskar Dirlewanger, the end was not going to be so clean. In May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into total ruin, Dirlewanger tried to disappear. He shed his SS uniform, took off his medals, and put on civilian clothes. He fled to the town of Altshausen in the French occupation zone of southern Germany. He thought he could hide in the chaos. He thought he was just another refugee in a sea of millions. But his face was too distinct. The gaunt, skeletal features, the cold eyes. He was recognized by a former prisoner. On June 1st, 1945, he was arrested by French authorities. He was placed in a local jail, but the French didn't have enough men to guard every prisoner. They used local auxiliaries, mostly Polish soldiers who had been liberated from German forced labor camps. These were men who knew exactly who Oskar Dirlewanger was. They knew what he had done in Warsaw. They knew about the Wola Massacre. They knew about the villages in Belarus. For years, they had lived under the shadow of the Black Hunter. Now, he was in their hands. The official records say that Oskar Dirlewanger died in his cell on the night of June 7, 1945. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the truth was far more visceral. The Polish guards didn't use guns. They didn't use a gallows. They took turns entering his cell throughout the night. They used their fists, their boots, and their rifle butts. They beat him with a slow, methodical fury. They wanted him to feel every ounce of the pain he had inflicted on their people. They beat him until his gaunt face was unrecognizable. They beat him until his ribs were crushed and his internal organs were destroyed. By the time the sun rose on June 8th, the monster was dead. He had been beaten to death over the course of several hours by the very people he had tried to exterminate. It was a brutal end for a brutal man, but the story didn't end with his death. For years, rumors circulated that Dirlewanger had escaped. People claimed to have seen him in South America, in Egypt, in the French Foreign Legion. The myth of the Black Hunter was so terrifying that people couldn't believe he was gone. The mystery grew so large that in 1960, the West German government ordered his body to be exhumed. They opened the grave in Altshausen and conducted a forensic examination. The bones were there. The gaunt skull was there. The fractures from the beating were clear. It was definitely Oskar Dirlewanger. The monster was truly dead, but the legacy of his unit remains a dark stain on the history of the 20th century. The Dirlewanger Brigade was the ultimate expression of the Nazi ideology. They were what happens when you strip away the laws of civilization and give total power to the most depraved elements of society. They were a reminder that the line between human and monster is held together by the rule of law, and when that law is removed, men like Oskar Dirlewanger are waiting in the shadows. He wasn't just a general. He was a symptom of a world that had gone mad. He was the man who was too brutal even for the Nazis, not because they disagreed with his goals, but because he was too honest about his methods. He didn't hide behind euphemisms like special treatment or final solution. He just burned barns and laughed. Today, in the district of Wola in Warsaw, there are monuments to the 40,000 civilians who died in those 3 days in August 1944. There are names carved in stone, faces in old photographs, and memories that are passed down from generation to generation. They are the silent witnesses to the crimes of the Black Hunter. And as long as those names are remembered, the truth about Oskar Dirlewanger will never be silenced. He tried to turn the world into a graveyard, but in the end, he became just another body in a shallow grave, a monster who was finally hunted down by his victims. That is the declassified truth of the Dirlewanger Brigade. That is the story of the general who was too brutal for Hitler. And that is why we must never look away from the dark chapters of our history, because the monsters of the past are always a warning for the future. The story of Oskar Dirlewanger is not a story of military strategy or political ideology. It is a story of the capacity for human evil when it is given a uniform and a license to kill. It is a story of how a disgraced criminal became a hero of a genocidal regime. And it is a story of how justice, however brutal, finally caught up with a man who thought he was beyond the reach of any law. In the ruins of Warsaw, in the charred forests of Belarus, and in the quiet jail cell in Altshausen, the legend of the Black Hunter was written in blood. And it serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when we let the monsters lead the way. Oskar Dirlewanger died in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his victims and the fists of his enemies. He left behind a world in ruins, and a name that is synonymous with the absolute limit of human depravity. He was the Black Hunter, the Butcher of Warsaw, the monster of the SS, and he was finally brought to ground by the very people he had tried to destroy. That is the end of the legend and the beginning of the memory. The graves in Warsaw are silent now, but the story they tell is a scream that echoes through time, a scream that warns us about what lies beneath the surface of civilization, a scream that tells us the name of the man who was too brutal even for Hitler. Oskar Dirlewanger, the hunter who became the hunted, the general who lost his humanity and found his end in a lonely cell. May his story be a warning for all time. And may the victims of the Wola Massacre never be forgotten, for in their memory lies the only true defense against the monsters of the future. The city of Warsaw has been rebuilt. The forests of Belarus are green again, but the scars remain. Scars on the land and scars on the human soul. Scars left by the men who followed the Black Hunter into the abyss. We look back at them not to celebrate their violence, but to understand its cost. To see the reality of war stripped of its glory and revealed as the slaughterhouse it truly is. That is the final lesson of Oskar Dirlewanger. That is the declassified truth of the WarFiles, and that is why we must continue to search for the hidden stories, the secret files, and the forgotten victims. For only by knowing the whole truth can we hope to prevent it from happening again. The monster is gone, but the shadows remain, and we are the ones who must shine the light.